And thank you all for being here. I want to thank the Bank Inter Foundation for inviting me. I've enjoyed very much the presentation so far, and I was very pleased yesterday to actually see that a lot of the discussion that we were having was things that I've lived personally in a lot of the projects that I've been involved with at Monitor and helping national, regional, cluster leaders, both from the private sector and from the public sector throughout the world. So today I hope to provide some further data that could, and I was looking for Carlos in particular, because I know that he likes data, so I was hoping that he'd be here, but basically hope to show you some data around the anecdotes that we heard yesterday, both from the regional presentations, but also from the later discussions in the day. Monitor's point of view and our point of view on global competitiveness, and for us, global competitiveness is really what drives prosperity. And for when you're a public policy maker, prosperity, as we define it, is a high and rising standard of living. The ultimate goal of a public official is to, of course, help lift all boats in a region, and one of the best ways to do that is to be competitive. Now, our point of view is one that says that regions aren't competitive or nations are not competitive, only companies are competitive. Firms are really the drivers of competitiveness. If you happen to have a lot of competitive companies in your region or your nation, then you can say that you're actually competitive. But our point of view is that competition is really driven by companies. And as such, the formula that we use to think about competitiveness includes things that occur within the company. And Larry's presentation yesterday illustrated how innovation impacts that competitiveness. And Mark's presentation later on will also show various aspects of that. But I want to turn your attention to the other side of the equation, which is what is happening around the firm. What is happening outside the firm in the business environment, what we call the business environment. And I hope to show you some data that will hopefully bring up some particularly relevant questions when we think about how innovation occurs, not just inside the company, but outside the company. And I'll go into a little bit more into that in a bit. But we do this because basically when we interview and work with executives, CEOs around the world, about half of their time is actually spent thinking about their business environment. We've done many surveys and interviews of them, and they say half my time is spent within things within the company, half my time is thinking about how innovation is harnessed outside my company. And so if it's important for them, it's important for us to try to understand that. So the approach that we take is one in which we say, okay, so you have in every region that a firm operates, you have a business environment. And this is based on Professor Michael Porter's work, one of the co-founders of Monitor Group. And we've taken it and operationalized it in these regions and with firms. And the point of view says that there's a number of drivers of competitiveness that are going to, at the end of the day, impact the prosperity of a region. And as such, are going to be driven by innovation. And the discussion last night at dinner was quite informative in the sense that, again, the the discussion yesterday, there was a lot of different opinions about what is innovation. For us at Monitor Group, we think about innovation as the ability of a firm to capture value for a specific amount of time, doing something unique and in a way that is an improvement upon various aspects of their operations, as Larry pointed out in the meeting yesterday. And that really is, there's a number of proxies that we actually can touch and see to help us understand what the innovative capacity of a firm is and what the innovative capacity of a region is. One of those is the ability of a region to provide the right types of specialized inputs to companies that operate there. And that has to do not just with the generic, primary and secondary education, the universities, but really very specialized programs that are tailor-made to the needs of executives in specific industries. And those needs and requirements differ tremendously across an economy, as you can imagine. Classic example is the requirements of the financial services companies in terms of telecommunications. Of course, time is critically important. Any downtime is going to have a detrimental effect to the bottom line. And so when we think about telecommunications infrastructure in a region, you have to be very attuned to the needs of those particular executives that are going to be different than executives in the heavy construction services industries, for example. And so we have a number of measures that we typically ask executives to rate their region on, their operations on, and these are what we call inputs, factor inputs. And again, it's not just theoretical research at the universities and the people coming out of those universities. It's actually what are the specialized programs that are really attuned to the needs of my industries. We also look at what is the competitive environment around in that region. What are the rules of the road, if you will? What are the incentives that government's providing, for example, in R&D? Are they providing any types of particular incentives there? And how is there a lot of competition, or is there a lot of collusion? What types of, and it varies obviously across countries. We also look at the sophistication of their customers, their local customers. And we do that because we find that innovation is incredibly much more efficient and there's a bigger impact when you can actually tap a group of very sophisticated and demanding local customers in a region for purposes of testing out products, for purposes of feedback to your current lines. And this is incredibly important to try to gauge. Classic examples are the Italian leather shoe industry that has very demanding customers locally in Italy. Italian women tend to be very savvy consumers of that particular product, and they use them to test out new products very quickly. Zara in Spain as well, very well known for doing that. The idea is to tap into that regionally and locally in order to improve the aspects of innovation that we heard Larry discuss yesterday in the presentation. Finally, we also take a look at the supplier networks in a region that are specifically geared towards servicing particular companies in that region. And we look for sophistication of suppliers. Are they world-class? Are they providing the right types of products? Does a company typically have to go outside of a region to really find sophisticated and leading-edge suppliers. These are critically important. These are outside a company's control, yet they are incredibly intimately tied to a company's innovation system and to their bottom line. And so we take a look at that and we ask executives to rate their region on those dimensions as well. And we'll take a closer look in this discussion today on exactly what happens in a cluster, because I think it'll shed some light on how innovation in particular is impacted at that level. It's a good cut-in point. But of course, we can't forget the government. They obviously have an incredible impact on the innovation environment in a region, and as a result on companies. And in particular, their impact on shepherding through legislation or particular incentives for spurring innovation in a region. And finally, we have these organizations called Institutions of Collaboration. And the Bank Inter Foundation is an example of that. It's those institutions that are in some ways sitting between the private sector and the public sector. Sometimes they're private, sometimes they're not. But they really help to glue everything together. They provide the forums, such as this one, for companies, executives, public sector officials to come in and really have meaningful discussions on these types of issues, like innovation, for example. And we find them incredibly important, and they're a big differentiator between regions that actually provide the types of environments that companies seek and they go and invest in, and the types of environments where they might not be interested, to invest. And so we actually look very much at that particular aspect of the business environment. Now, this is data from Professor Porter. He presents this data every year at Davos. We use it, and we also overlay it with regional data that we have. He uses national data. And what you see here is the GDP per capita and the business competitiveness index, which is an index composed of the executives, the opinions of the executives that have filled out the questionnaire around the diamond that I just showed you. And again, we have this data for both countries, regions, but also for clusters around the world. And it's, as you can tell right for this particular slide, Spain is obviously at a very rich country in relative terms, prosperous country, and certainly aims to be incredibly efficient at churning out that GDP per capita. But of course, it's perhaps the business environment as it's rated by the executives in Spain is not at all competitive with the types of countries that it tries to emulate on a prosperity basis. So when we think about competitiveness in Spain, and that's impacted again by innovation and to a large degree, Spain, unfortunately, at the moment, is competing with the Portugals, Estonias, and Chiles of the world instead of the Denmark, Switzerlands of the world that it should be competing in. And the idea is for Spain to really move to the right in that index. And the way to do that, again, is to provide the type of business environment that executives feel is so critical to the to the innovation of their companies. We, again, as I mentioned, we ask a lot of questions to these executives. We work with them on their internal affairs, but also on these business environment projects. And we asked about 3,400 executives the question of, considering all the factors, is your region a good place to innovate? And we found there was a high correlation between certain elements of the business environment and the ability of a company to feel that it was getting a lot of innovation from that particular investment in that region. And in particular, of course, government responsiveness was critical. Investments in R&D, as you would imagine. And, the specialized research facilities, again, that idea that it's just not enough for a region to provide generic research. It really has to be tailored, and the conversation has to be incredibly intimate between the head of research of the company and the head of the research of the university for it to really be meaningful for the university. And as you can well imagine, these executives make investment decisions based on these elements when it comes to innovation. The university industry networking capabilities was also rated quite high. It's not just enough to provide the research. It has to be done in a way that is going to actually foster the types of conversations that we're having today at a cluster level with people that sort of speak the same language. And that was incredibly important, again, for the executives. We did a project in particular with the Council on Competitiveness in the United States, and that's a group that was formed originally to see how the U.S. could compete against Japan in the early 80s. It then grew into other areas. We did a project there about 4 years ago. We interviewed about 1,000 executives in 5 regions in the United States, 15 clusters, and we asked them to rate their regional environment as either a poor innovation environment or a good innovation environment. And then we asked them what the region had an ample supply of in particular. Again, advanced educational programs were much more likely to be found in places that were rated a good innovation environment versus not. Specialized research centers, specialized suppliers, again, were incredibly important to an executive rating it a good innovation environment. Cost of doing business is irrelevant. As you can imagine, companies will invest in high-cost places. It's not about low cost. It really is about finding those very specialized talents that are inherently found in a region. And for executives that rated it a good innovation environment, it was important to have these elements. We also asked them about the linkages. I spoke about the institutions for collaboration and the importance of them. Disproportionately so, these were incredibly important for executives when it came to rating their environment as a good innovation environment or not. In particular, the help received from cluster companies for startups was incredibly important. The ability of not just to do research and have it be there, but actually turn those ideas into commercializable products. And the transfer of that knowledge either through licensing of university research and, some universities are very good at it, some are not. We were talking yesterday about Columbia University in particular. It's sort of, nobody really noses in any great degree because Stanford and MIT get a lot of credit, but Columbia is actually 2 times better at licensing their research than either Stanford or MIT in terms of the return on their investments into that research. So, some universities are better than others at it. It's incredibly important for companies to actually have that transfer of knowledge be accessible for them when they make investment decisions. Again, the ability of suppliers to really work cohesively with a firm in a region was incredibly important. It wasn't enough to have them have some operations there, but actually the communication that occurs, the back and forth, the product testing, the help in the evolution of that innovation and that conversation was incredibly important for executives. And of course, I mentioned sophisticated suppliers. Again, disproportionately found in good innovation environments versus not so good innovation environments. Now, I mentioned clusters previously, and whenever we do our projects, we actually take different cuts. Sometimes we work with national leaders, presidents, or sometimes we work with regional leaders, for example, governors of different states. And sometimes we work with cluster organizations that are basically made up of companies that have like-minded industries. And we feel that clusters is actually a good cut-in point to talk about innovation and how it actually is impacting firms. And in particular, there's a lot of confusion out there about what a cluster is at the end of the day. Our point of view is that it's incredibly important to understand the competitive dynamics of what is occurring inside a company, as I mentioned, and of course on a macroeconomic environment in a country. It's also incredibly important, of course, to take a close look at an industry and a sector. But those cut-in points really don't give you the type of nuance that occurs in looking at the drivers of innovation that I just mentioned previously. What we feel is incredibly important is to actually agglomerate those industries into clusters, and we do so by doing it statistically, but also through knowledge of these industries. And looking at the relationships between the suppliers, the big companies, the small to medium-sized companies, the universities in the region, and looking at how those relationships occur, the dynamics of them, the output that they provide, and really cutting in at that level to provide the type of insights that would be not found if you were to do a sector analysis or if you were to do just a company analysis. Again, these are based on many projects around the world where we've had an opportunity to talk to, listen, and really work with national, regional leaders. What we found, and this is data from, again, the United States in particular, this particular data I'm going to show you right now, is that the economy is divided into three different groups of clusters: traded clusters, local clusters, and natural resource clusters. What ends up happening is that traded clusters are about a third of your employment in a region, typically. And this is, again, data from the U.S., but we've found to be pretty much the same in Europe and Japan, all the advanced economies. And what ends up happening is that the average wages between traded clusters and local clusters are almost twice as much in the traded clusters. Traded clusters are providing any product or service that find the customer not just locally, but also globally. Local clusters are clusters or firms that have services or products that can only be consumed locally. Examples of that are sort of gas stations, barbershops, any of the retail firms or industries that are considered to be in a local cluster. Hospitals as well. Again, traded clusters are going to bring disproportionate returns for regions, in the sense that even though they're only a third of your employment in a region, they actually have much higher levels of innovation. They have relative productivity levels that are much higher, again, due to economies of scale, but also just inherently the innovation that occurs in those types of industries. And I'll show you some examples in a bit. And they also grow much quicker in terms of prosperity to their employees, which is what we measure with average wages. At the end of the day, if you can pay your workers more, it means you've been able to extract some value from the service or product that you've been offering in a meaningful way over time. And natural resource industries are only a small sliver of your economy, typically, especially in advanced economies. And they have pretty good average wages, but they're so small that we really try to concentrate on the traded clusters. Natural resource clusters provide comparative advantage versus competitive advantage. So what's a cluster? Again, there's a lot of confusion out there about what exactly is happening in a cluster. I'm going to provide you a diagram or a snapshot of what one typical cluster looks like. This is an example from Houston, the oil and gas cluster in Houston. And of course, with Houston, you have the large companies that are, the Exxon Mobils of the world, the Texacos of the world that have operations there, have been there historically, have incredible contributors to employment, to innovation. But when you think about Houston and you think about the oil and gas cluster in Houston, there shouldn't be one in Houston any longer. There hasn't been oil in Houston in a long time in any significant way. So when you think about why does ExxonMobil really retain a large percentage of their operations in Houston? Why not move to where the oil is? Well, the reason is that they actually find very specialized, sophisticated suppliers, very sophisticated executives, very sophisticated talent, and advanced talent in Houston available there where they can't find that in a place like Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or other places where there is a lot of oil. And so when you think about the executives that are coming out of the big oil companies, they tend to, in very competitive regions, they tend to set up new companies, very small companies that provide very specialized services. And the classic example is when the first Gulf War occurred and the Kuwaitis had to deal with the oil fires. They looked for very specialized engineers that could help them put out those fires in Kuwait. They couldn't find them. They went to Saudi Arabia next door, where most of the world's oil is, and they couldn't find them there either. They actually had to go to Houston to find them. And for a while there, a number of those companies actually, basically lived in Kuwait trying to put out those fires, but they were very, very specialized suppliers of a service. And they were in Houston because they also took advantage of the specialized educational institutions in the region that provided the type of training that these executives needed. And the conversation between the small to medium-sized companies and the large companies in Houston, in that cluster, was a very tight one with the people that were setting the curriculum. universities. They have those types of conversations that allow them to really churn out the pipeline of future employees that are going to have the types of skills that they need. And that's why they stay in Houston, not because there's oil there, simply because they find these types of companies there. Another important indicator that we look at is entrepreneurship and the level of impact that entrepreneurship has on a cluster. I mentioned these small to medium-sized companies. In one particular project for the government of Denmark that we did, they wanted to find out how could you explain why some regions are better than others at creating high entrepreneurship, good entrepreneurship environment and performance. What policies were in place that could help explain why that occurs? And so we went about with the OECD and the Danish government to try to map out what potential policies could impact innovation at the entrepreneurship level and also impact the performance of those companies. And these were not mom and pop entrepreneurs. These were actually the gazelles of the world, the high-performing small to medium-sized companies. And so we built a model, like all good consultants, around the types of policies that you could possibly think of that could help, that could impact either positively or negatively entrepreneurs. Everything from availability of seed capital or VC capital to training programs at universities to administrative burdens to cultural mindsets. And so we literally came up with about 120 measures that could potentially impact entrepreneurs in a region. And we did some regressions with responses from entrepreneurs throughout the world, throughout the 14 countries that we surveyed, which included a number of countries in Europe, the U.S., Singapore, Korea, India, China, and Russia. And we found that there was a high correlation between some very specific policies that were found in a regional environment and the ability of those regions to really provide excellent entrepreneurship environments. And in particular, what was really evident to us, and again, we want to test this in a number of other countries, but at first glance, what's very striking is the impact of culture and mindset. And it's funny because most of the conversation yesterday actually revolved around that. Can you create an entrepreneur? Is that actually possible? Or is it just inherently found in the culture? Is there something about the culture that allows for people to take risks with their career? And we found there were some regions that provided the type of environment, where a government job was less appealing than a job as an entrepreneur, where entrepreneurs were celebrities, where entrepreneurship as a career choice was actually a good choice, where the ability to take on risk was significantly higher in a statistical terms than in other regions. And also the ability of entrepreneurs to reap the rewards from that risk. Is there a stigma attached to declaring bankruptcy in a society? Or is it like the United States where, at least until very recently, it was okay to declare bankruptcy, and you could wear the serial entrepreneur badge as a badge of honor. Again, these types of attitudes and abilities of entrepreneurs to really reap the rewards from that risk were critically important to helping to explain why certain regions were better than others. On the financing side, it was very interesting because what we found was that availability of seed capital was incredibly much more important, according to the entrepreneurs that we surveyed, than even VC money. And the idea is that once you get to the VC stage, your idea has been vetted by a number of people. You've sort of done the first proof of concept, and the real critical point is actually just starting out, just getting that initial sort of idea through to its first stage. And regions that had very established, very well-developed angel investor networks that could put together entrepreneurs with these types of friends and family was incredibly important for entrepreneurs. And so you hear, and we've studied and worked with a number of regions where that's actually the case. One region I think about is San Diego. And in particular, there's a program at the University of California in San Diego called UC Connect that is rated by entrepreneurs as a sort of a best practice in terms of bringing these types of entrepreneurs together with these angel investors, with professors that can vet some of these business plans in a forum that's actually meaningful for entrepreneurs. Skills development was another area that was interesting to us. Of course, we all know it's important to teach entrepreneurship at the university level, and entrepreneurs certainly said that was important. But it was also incredibly important to teach kids at the primary and secondary school levels about entrepreneurships. And we heard yesterday about the sangria stand. And in some ways, that's what makes the U.S. Such a good place for kids to start learning about entrepreneurship from a very early age. And entrepreneurs throughout the world said that actually matters at the end of the day. Credits and incentives for R&D was also found to be incredibly important as a decision for entrepreneurs to set up their businesses there. The ability to exit, to actually cash out from that risk was also important. And again, these aspects of culture, attitudes towards bankruptcy, ability of entrepreneurs to tap into the stock markets, established stock markets, was, again, quite important in helping to explain that. Again, the clusters bring together a number of dynamics that we feel and that we've seen from what the executives have told us to be of great benefit. Not just from an efficiency standpoint of being close together with your suppliers, with your customers, but also in stimulating the commercialization of ideas from the universities and the research that goes on there and turning those into profitable companies. That interchange that occurs at a local level, regional level, at a cluster was found to be incredibly important for entrepreneurs. I promised that I would show some data from Madrid, and what we've done is we've tapped into our database that allows us to measure clusters in a standardized fashion. The problem up to now has been that it's very difficult to actually get competitiveness measurements of regions across the world because, of course, everybody measures their economy in a different way. We've been able to compile data from a number of regions around the world and actually do some statistical testing that groups the ways countries measure their economies in a way that you can construct clusters and compare across different regions. And this gives you the ability to actually compare a region like Madrid or a cluster in Madrid to relevant peer group clusters or regions throughout the world. And again, we had data from North America, most of Europe, with the exception of Northern Ireland for some reason. I don't know why, but the UK doesn't release those figures. And the Russian economy, Japanese economy, Korean economy, Chinese economy. And what this allows us to do is quickly get a snapshot of what a regional economy is doing in terms of competitiveness at the cluster level, at the microeconomic level. And this provides you a quick way to look at the performance of and the competitiveness of particular parts of your economy. So we ran the numbers, and we got a good map of what the Madrid economy is in relation to Europe, to the countries in the European database. And let me explain this slide because it's actually one of the ways in which we use as a departure point to talk about competitiveness and innovation. What you see here is a snapshot of Madrid, the Madrid economy compared to Europe. The bubbles in the snapshot are clusters, the traded clusters. In fact, there's about 40 bubbles there that are traded clusters. And I mentioned the traded clusters were about a third of the Madrid economy. The dashed line, the dashed horizontal line, is the size of the Madrid economy in relation to Europe. So Madrid is about 1.4% of total employment for Europe. Any cluster above that horizontal dashed line would indicate that Madrid has a higher concentration of employment in that cluster than you would imagine given the size of the Madrid economy. So, for example, business services has about 2.1%. The business service cluster in Madrid is about 2.1% of total employment in business clusters throughout Europe. So it's relatively more concentration than you would think given the size of Madrid. Any cluster to the right of this vertical line indicates that cluster is growing, that cluster in Madrid is growing faster in relative terms than its peer clusters throughout Europe. So, in fact, when you think about publishing and printing cluster, it's growing at about 10% more quickly in relative terms than all peer clusters in Europe. So this very quickly gives you a snapshot of, well, what part of my economy is doing well, what part is not in terms of the microeconomic performance and competitiveness. As you can tell, Madrid is actually doing quite well, at least during this time frame of 1999 to 2004. In a number of important clusters, certainly a lot of Madrid's most highest employing clusters, which is the size of the bubble, is the number of employees. And in fact, heavy construction services has been performing quite well. Entertainment production services. Air transport. Madrid benefits from having a very good airport with linkages, especially to Latin America and Europe, that allow it to be a hub, a logistics hub in terms of air transport. Communication services, also very sophisticated and very performing quite well in terms of its peer clusters in Europe. Again, we tend to see that regions that are very competitive tend to have about 8 to 10 clusters in the upper right quadrant. And that's really where you want to see a lot of your clusters. Biopharma there's a higher concentration of employment here than you would imagine, but it's growing slightly less quickly than other biopharma clusters in Europe. So any cluster that sort of migrates over to this quadrant, you're still pretty competitive, but over time, you're going to lose that competitiveness. There's something happening there. What the cluster maps do is they show you the what is happening. What we then do with the executive survey that I mentioned that we use, that I showed the data for earlier, is that tells us why it's happening. Why is the biopharma cluster not growing as quickly as other biopharma clusters in Europe? So this very quickly gives you a chance to prioritize your investments if you're a public sector leader. And as a cluster, it tells you, okay, what part of our cluster is not really performing well, because we can then double-click on each of these bubbles and find out what the components are of the clusters and what parts of the cluster are not doing so well, what parts are actually performing above their weight class. One last slide that I want to show is Madrid versus the amalgamated economies of Europe, U.S., Japan, South Korea. The nice thing about the database, it allows you to tinker with the comparison set. And if you compare Madrid as if it were part of this sort of more global economy, at least from an advanced economy perspective, you again see similar clusters there that are performing quite well. And this allows public policymakers to really get a good sense of, well, how's my economy performing versus relevant peer groups? How are we, everybody talks, well, how are we performing against the U.S.? Well, this can quickly give you a snapshot of that. And we can use this for the discussion later on today. And when we think about sort of, if we pick 4 clusters, and I think we've picked ICT, tourism, business services, and biopharma, right? And so we'll use these diagrams to kind of help guide the discussion and to really kind of see, well, why is that happening? Why is biopharma where it is? And again, I'll end on this, the importance of these discussions. At the end of the day, Bankinter Foundation is an institution of collaboration, and it provides a number of benefits to companies. I suspect that some of you that are executives in the private sector are here because of some of these reasons. These types of forums are incredibly important, and we like to see more Bankinter Foundations in a region providing these types of activities and opportunities to share information, to get different perspectives. And I just wanted to end on this slide in the sense that we're strong believers in this, and really find that it creates meaningful change for companies in regions and provides the type of information they need for creating good innovation environments. And that's it for my presentation.